for 25 years. Cable's gift to America.
Shortly before the September 11 Commission made its report public today, a citizens group released a critique of that report. This briefing by 9/11 Citizens Watch is 1 hour.
Welcome. First, I'd like to take a moment to thank C-SPAN for covering our press conference today. Also, our thanks go out to the National Press Club for hosting the event, and to our club sponsor, John Edward Hurley. So thank you for being here and taking note of the work of 9/11 Citizens Watch. Thank you especially to all our fellow researchers, investigative journalists, and supporters who have contributed in one fashion or another to our parallel investigation of 9/11 and the concurrent oversight of the National Commission on Terrorist Acts upon the United States, otherwise known as the 9/11 Commission. We've done this over the past year and a half. My name is Kyle Hentz. I'm co-founder with John Judge of 9/11 Citizens Watch. You'll find our bios in your press kits and those of our guest speakers here today. You can find us on the web at www.911citizenswatch.org. First, a brief history about our organization. We founded Citizens Watch on March 31st of last year, 2003, in New York City at the time and place of the very first hearing held by the 9/11 Commission. We came together with a mission to monitor the work of the 9/11 Commission and that of a growing community of independent, truly independent researchers and investigators who have been closely examining the events of and surrounding the attacks of 9/11. In so doing, we've identified emerging evidence neglected in large part by the 9/11 Commission, that one, this commission is anything but independent. Two, its integrity has been deeply compromised due to a failure to apply a high investigative standard, play hardball, and demand accountability of military officials and of Democrats and Republicans alike. And three, and perhaps most importantly, the unsubstantiated, simplistic official story offered us for what happened does not stand up under scrutiny. And further, we've identified considerable prima facie evidence, though largely circumstantial, should still lead any prudent investigator or prosecutor worth his salt to seriously allow for at least the possibility of a wider circle complicity than the 19 identified by the Justice Department immediately after 9/11. That there was perhaps inside facilitation, funding, or even implementation of the attacks by as yet unidentified co-conspirators. This, for us, is the elephant in the room, a body of evidence that many fear acknowledging, even looking at, and understandably confronting. It is our challenge now, all of us, to speak out and lead and lend the highest degree of scrutiny to the Commission's report that's coming out today, and to this growing body of evidence compiled by independent investigators and the witnesses and whistleblowers largely ignored to date. So now, with the Commission having concluded its public hearings and their issuance of the final report today, our work truly begins in earnest. We are pleased to see that such interest in the prelude to our final report, this one dealing mostly with process. Our final report, issued before 9/11 of this year, will be more a substantive analysis once we've had a chance to review the Commission's final report. Given the catalog of compromises, flawed premises, conflicts of interest, unanswered questions, neglected areas of inquiry, and ignored whistleblowers, we have drawn a most reasonable and fully justified conclusion that the report being released today by this so-called independent commission cannot possibly be deemed definitive or authoritative as an account for the events of September 11th, not by any stretch of the imagination. And given the resistance, obstructions, foot-dragging by the White House and other government agencies through the course of the investigation, particularly by NORAD and the Department of Justice, it is clear that most of the professionals and officials in positions of responsibility at the time of 9/11 would have preferred no investigation whatsoever into the murder of 3,000 people from over 80 nations. But alas, they got one the victim families members fought long and hard for. Unfortunately, we expect that what they will get in the end is a whitewash, and one most Americans, we feel, should greet as a farce, an out-and-out cover-up, and a shameful, colossal spin job. Let us mince no words. Our final report, drawn from a variety of sources, will, when released, substantiate these strong words and challenge to the work of this commission. Our first report, given the fact that we have not yet seen the commission's report, is primarily a detailed critique of the deeply flawed investigative process itself, and deals primarily with the first 2 points I just mentioned, leaving the disturbing analysis and implications to later probing report, focusing on more substance and content. Now I'd like to turn to co-founder of Citizens Watch, John Judge, who will shed some light and share with us some specific details contained in our report being released today. John Judge.
Morning. We have prepared this citizens' critique of the Commission's process, and it's fairly clear to us that the process having been flawed, that we anticipate that the report that issues from the Commission will be similarly flawed. Compared to other investigations of major historical incidents like Pearl Harbor, or the assassination of John F. Kennedy, or the Shuttle Challenger, this commission was from the beginning minimally funded and pushed into a very tight time slot compared to most of those other investigations. And that forced it into, we believe, a rush to judgment. It did get an extension of time. It wanted to go to January of next year and got 2 more months. And finished its work within a schedule that had more to do with the elections, we believe, than had to do with the investigation and the probative questions themselves. It took its cues from the joint inquiry by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, but they set a premise of an intelligence failure, and that was their focus, and this commission followed in those footsteps in large part. It was founded with a law that put obstacles in its way as well, from our point of view, as well as being obstructed from its inception by the White House and the executive agencies. And there were serious compromises made with those agencies in terms of how they would get testimony, what documents they would have access to, all sorts of conditions on whether or not particular people would testify, and what record would be made of those testimonies. Over 1,000 people have been interviewed, we are told, most of them not under oath. In the beginning, none of their public testimony was taken under oath until families and Citizens Watch and other groups complained. And we have no idea what the recording of that will be. For instance, we're told that Condoleezza Rice's 4-hour private testimony with the Commission, there is no record, no recording, no transcript, and only notes that survive. The Commission was also caught in a conundrum that many investigations are in the current period, that in order for the national security state to investigate any major incident, it can only vet those people that are already part of that system in large part to take a look at that system, because they're the only ones in the society that are allowed to see into it. And so there was no one put on the Commission from a totally independent position, no family members put on there. And some of the people had conflicts or potential conflicts of interest that concerned the families and the citizen groups. Chairman Thomas Keene had financial ties with Amerada Hess Oil, and at one point was in a joint operation with Osama bin Laden's brother-in-law, and he was also connected with the National Endowment for Democracy, which has taken over historically from the USAID in terms of carrying on covert operations on behalf of U.S. intelligence agencies abroad. Similarly, other members were parts of earlier flawed investigations into Contragate and Watergate. They sit on military, Pentagon, and intelligence advisory boards for the most part. They have ties into the past, including the Nixon resignation period. One of them was even accused by students of being deep throat in the Watergate situation, and their executive director was so conflicted that the families called for his resignation. And his work on the Kennedy tapes on the Bay of Pigs was so sloppily done that the director of the Kennedy Center said that no scholar or student could rely on him. And yet we have to rely on the notes that he took at the presidential hearing in terms of what we're going to do. He was co-authored a book with Condoleezza Rice. It came to the family's attention that he was part of the transition team into the Bush House for the National Security Council. In addition to that, the flawed premises of the report, we believe, will go nowhere outside the official story. For instance, one of the investigative teams was called Al-Qaeda and the Terrorist Plot. It wasn't called Who's Behind 9/11. It named the suspect in the beginning of its investigation. And the procedures that the commission followed involved a lack of transparency, an inability to bring forward or willingness to bring forward alternative witnesses or points of view, even on public policy issues, a process that left a lack of accountability of the people in the government agencies, and that suffered under the excessive secrecy of the Bush administration, with some evidence destroyed and much evidence concealed, and to date no release of non-classified evidence to back up the claims of the report. There are several key omissions and contradictions in the report, we believe, from the testimony that we've seen and the public statements of the staff. And some of the major areas that we think are not going to be covered are the historical context in Afghanistan and the U.S. covert operations there and what led into the roots of the Al-Qaeda, that the background on even the suspects themselves has not been clarified, their identities or what or who might be the actual sponsors of the event. The foreknowledge and forewarnings that were given were not taken into serious account at the hearings, at least. In addition to that, the response of NORAD and FAA, they had 2 hearings out of 19 on this topic and left with a timeline that still is muddled and contradicts the earlier timeline and doesn't make sense in terms of responses. To just give you one understanding in relation to that, they keep talking about this was a hijacking and they were waiting to hear if it was a hijacking, and until they found that out, the planes didn't go up to scramble. It was an unprecedented event. It was planes used as weapons which hadn't been seen before. An air emergency begins when the transponder goes off, when the communication with tower ends. It begins when the plane goes off course. It begins when it doesn't respond to tower commands. That's the point at which communication goes back to the FAA headquarters. The liaisons there get online with NORAD, and planes go up within 6 to 10 minutes. 67 times in the year prior to this, the FAA and NORAD system worked in that way in a timely fashion to scramble planes in air emergencies, but worked not at all on September the 11th that year. And another area that we felt, because it's a commission on terrorist acts and could have included additional terrorist acts in its scope, that it should have addressed the anthrax attacks, an investigation that stalled basically at the gate of Fort Detrick and hasn't picked up since. Their policy recommendations, which was the bulk of their hearings, were held and discussed before the events of the day were clarified. So rather than moving from historical fact to policy, the opposite happened. The hearings that they did have on policy, as far as we can see, are going to extenuate and replicate what we think has been a flawed policy in general of response to terrorism, domestic policy, international law, permanent war economy, and many of the excesses on civil liberties that followed after 9/11, that those will not be challenged. So that's some of the points that are made in this 63-page report. As I say, we're in the position of critiquing it before it comes out, so we can't tell you exactly what's in it, but Keene had said that not to expect surprises and that it would merely fill in a few gaps from what we'd already seen. So we brought our critique based on watching them very closely over these months and going to all the hearings and reading through all the testimony.
Thank you, John. Now I'd like to invite Matthew Salito. Matthew lost his son, Matthew C. Salito, who is 23 years old. He worked for Cantor Fitzgerald. Matthew? Thank you for being here.
Thank you for letting me come up, because I have to leave here right after I get done speaking to go to a preview of the commission report as a family member that's involved with the 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism. First, I'd like to tell you, as a family member, I think this nation owes a debt of gratitude to the families of 9/11, because if it weren't for them, this commission would not be here today. I, Matthew Salito, feel this nation owes a debt of gratitude to Tom Kane, because I kind of think the administration thought they were going to get a whitewash, and some people may still think it's a whitewash, but I feel Tom Kane did a great job in holding the committee together and getting to the bottom as far as he could to the task that was given to them. And remember what the task was. Find out what happened, how it happened, and prevent it from ever happening again. And they gave that committee a budget of $3 million. Now, I'm not from Washington, D.C. You people are. What is, the most devastating thing that ever happened on our soil, and you're charging a committee to find out how it won't happen again and give them a budget of $3 million is ridiculous. Through family pressure, through the press, it was gotten up to $15 million, which we, again, owe a debt of gratitude to the families. Things that I were disappointed in is the president, who was our leader, after the most dastardly thing on our soil ever happened, had to be forced through families and the press to have this committee. He had to be forced to have his cabinet people testify on this committee. He himself said he would not testify in front of the committee, but through family pressure through the press, he not only had his cabinet people speak in front of him, but he himself spoke in front of them. The time limit was pushed. Why? Because family members, through the press, put pressure on. The point is, as the leader of our nation at a time that 9/11 happened, I would think that he would be in the forefront, leading and demanding and giving as much time that's needed to find out how something like this is going to be prevented from happening again. One of the disheartening things that I go through is that, again, I'm part of this lawsuit of 9/11 Families United to Bankrupt Terrorism. We have 17 countries cooperating with us. I'll name a few: Spain, Germany, Italy, on and on and on, opening up their books, showing us how money was funneled to the terrorists. Yet, when we go to our State Department, they will not say one thing to us. As Americans, as an American, I find that disheartening. I think you as Americans should find that disheartening. Why would the rest of the world want to cooperate with us, and we can't get past first base with our own State Department and administration? So, in conclusion, I'd like to say I think the committee did a good job, one that it was given the task of finding out what happened. I think Tom Kane did a stellar job. And I think the families truly should be admired by the rest of the country, because all we tried to do, my son is gone, but we as family members wanted this to happen so your child, your mother, your father won't be taken the next time this happens, and we'll be prepared. I want to thank this group for giving me time to speak. And I thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I'd like now to introduce a 27, I'd like to now introduce Jules Aronson. Jules is also a victim family member. He lost his sister, Myra, on Flight 11. Jules?
Oh, thank you. I just have a few remarks. Obviously, I haven't read the report, so I'm not going to comment about the content. But what I want to focus on is the subject of the climate that may have led to the 9/11 tragedy. That is, we all know now that there are multitudes in the Middle East, and particularly the Muslim world, that really hate us. And I don't think this question has really been adequately addressed. Of course, it's important. It's important to do practical things to combat the terrorism, maybe from a military point of view. But we'll never get rid of this hatred and this, which generates many recruits to terrorism, unless we address this question. So what is what I would hope the commission would have done was to address the historical context of the 9/11 tragedy. That is, what have we done to aid Al-Qaeda or its predecessors? And as I said, why do the multitudes of Muslims really hate us? And this, of course, is a complex question. I think unless we look at our policies, both now and what we have done in the past to create this climate, the war on terrorism will never end. In fact, it looks now with the war in Iraq and that it's getting even worse. And so, I think the commission, from what I know of the testimony, and probably has done a very good job. In general, I think unfortunately, in reaching a compromise, they may have missed some critical points. But I don't think this question really has been addressed. And I really feel that aside from practical points of such as trying to trace the people who are involved in fostering this terrorism in 9/11, that if we really had, what we really need to do now is to look at our policies and our and what we are doing as a nation to foster this. I think our leadership really doesn't understand other cultures, and in so doing this, they're really making things worse. So this is just my point of view, and I want to thank the members here and for inviting me.
Thank you. I'd like to bring up now a 27-year veteran analyst with the CIA, Ray McGovern.
I should make clear, although it's probably clear from my appearance, that I'm retired from the CIA and no longer active working there. There is a short squib that I wrote that's on the back of this one, which you might miss in your packet. So I'll go lightly over what that says and just make a few general observations. I think it's really important to remember, with respect to the genesis of this report, that it was resisted mightily, as John has already said, by the administration, Dick Cheney at first said that if there were any kind of commission like this, the White House might refuse to send anyone over to testify. And then when it was the pressure grew for some kind of inquiry into this terrible event, he acquiesced, or he and Bush acquiesced in the appointment of a joint congressional committee because Cheney saw that he could control that through his cat's paw Porter Goss, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, and indeed he did so most flagrantly when there was a leak, not necessarily from the committee, but Cheney persuaded Goss and Bob Graham to send the FBI in, an unprecedented violation of the separation of powers, having the FBI, part of the the executive branch, investigate committees of Congress. Committees, by the way, responsible for overseeing the activities of the FBI. So that's part of the background here that I think we really have to realize is in the woodwork. All right, good.
Is that better?
Thank you, yeah. That committee, of course, the Joint Congressional Committee, issued its report, its final report at the end of 2002, but when it had the public hearing in September, Eleanor Hill, the executive director, a very gutsy lady, a very competent lady, formerly Inspector General of the Pentagon, stopped all the proceedings in the beginning and said, now I have to tell you folks something very important before we proceed, and that is that negotiations with the White House went well into the evening, and we failed. We failed to get White House and Central Intelligence Agency approval to mention anything in this report, anything having to do with what the President was told prior to 9/11. Even if that information is already publicly available, we were forbidden to include that in our report, okay? And indeed, when the report came out at the end of the year, not a word on that. Continuity? Look at the Senate Intelligence Committee report from 2 weeks ago. Same thing. They draw the line at what the President did with the intelligence information that he had. So this is a very important point, because if you don't look into this, then nobody's responsible. Harry Truman said the buck stops here. Well, that seems to have been long forgotten by President Bush, who says he really respects Harry Truman. There is no accountability. The President has said that he can't recall ever having made a mistake. Well, let me tell you, folks, that filters right down to the lowest GS3 working in the federal system. And that kind of example is what causes things like the incredible malfeasance and misfeasance that attended the intelligence and law enforcement performance having to do with 9/11. So don't be taken in, all right? We already know enough about what the report says. What it says is that there were mistakes made. There were 10 missed opportunities. Well, parenthetically, I would say that this is the 11th, okay? This report is the 11th missed opportunity. But nobody really was responsible. It was the system. It had to be the system. And so what we're going to do is we're going to fix the system. We're going to tweak it. We're going to, in my view, rearrange the Director of Central Intelligence's chair on the deck of the Titanic and move it up one tier, okay? None of that is necessary. What you need is integrity. What you need is accountability. I've seen the system work. And one of the things that really grates me is that not one of the commission members has any intelligence community experience whatsoever. You've heard it said already, and it's true, that this is not an independent commission, okay? Not only that, it's not a representative commission. Everyone on that commission looks exactly like me, except one woman, a token woman, okay? All are either lawyers or politicians. Some are both. My grandmother used to talk about the upper crust. Well, that's what we have here, the ruling class, the royal class. It reminds me very much of Lord Hutton and Lord Butler, both of whom ran their own inquiries and came up with the correct answer. The correct answer being mistakes were made, It's a collective sort of problem. No one person, no one individual is responsible. That leads to disaster, as we have seen. The last thing is I'd stress that no one on the Commission knew anything about intelligence. Now, let me just finish up by stressing what I think is going to be very interesting. And no one here, I think, has read the report yet. But in view of what I've said about information being prohibited with respect to what the President knew before 9/11, it's going to be very interesting to see how the Commission finesses this problem. Now, it's thoroughly politicized, the Commission. It's acutely partisan. So how are they going to parse this? How are they going to face this very delicate issue? We all know that the President was given copious warnings before 9/11 in the spring and summer of 2001. And how are they going to finesse that with the reality that neither the President nor his National Security Advisor knew what to do? Could he not have delayed his vacation a day or two? Could he not have gotten together with his national security advisors? Could they not have warned the airlines and the airports in a more definitive way? So it's going to be very interesting to see how they come out on that. That's where it hits the fan, and I think that I can predict very confidently that just as the British in a very gentle and gentlemanly sort of due deference, professional courtesy sort of way. After all, most of them are lawyers. They will come up with what is indelicately called a whitewash. A last word here, and that is that I'm just delighted that Jules mentioned the historical context, because, as is well known, if you wish to combat terrorism, well, it's just like, just like defeating malaria. Everyone knows that to defeat malaria, you set up sharpshooters around the swamp and you try to kill as many mosquitoes as you can flying out of the swamp. That's how you defeat malaria, right? Right. Well, how do you defeat terrorism, folks? You don't defeat them the Rumsfeld way by killing as many as you can. You defeat them by asking, what makes these people hate us? What makes these people hate us? And it's not our democracy, and it's not our freedom. It's our policy, stupid. It's our policy. It's our tanks. It's our helicopter gunships that are bulldozing Palestinian homes. It's our tanks that support Ariel Sharon. The Arabs feel real strongly about that, and I would too. And that's the basic one. Invading Iraq certainly didn't help, and Ariel Sharon is as much responsible for that decision and his supporters in our government as is anyone else, because as you probably know, if you look closely, the so-called neocons have great difficulty distinguishing between what they perceive to be the strategic vision, the strategic needs of Israel, and the strategic needs of our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ray. In just a minute, we're going to open up to questions, but I want to acknowledge the statements that are in your press kits. One from Bill Doyle, who lost his son Joseph, has a statement. We'll be posting this on our website for those who are interested, but in interest of time, we want to turn it over to questions. Also, Judith Jackson-Reese sent us a statement, and I want to thank both Judith and Bill for doing so. Again, we'll post that on our website, www.911citizenswatch.org. Before I turn this over to questions, one last thing. We would like to make a call to any whistleblowers, any members of government, former members of government, who have something to say about the events of 9/11 in response to this commission, to come forward, to the press, to our organization. Daniel Ellsberg is running a project called the Whistleblower Project, the Truth-Telling Project, and he too is doing the same relative to Iraq and 9/11. So with that, thank you for your patience and thank you for being here, and we'll take questions to all of us here. Thank you very much. There is a wireless handheld, and if you'll wait for Ariel before asking your question, we'd very much appreciate that. Thank you very much.
Chris Strom with the National Journal. What are maybe the three most important unanswered questions that you see at this point based on the research that you've done that you don't feel that the 911 report is going to answer? What are those questions that you feel that are not being answered that the American public should know?
Well, first, I'd like to reiterate what John raised and mentioned in our report being released today, and that is the fact that they completely excluded an examination of the anthrax attacks. And the reason why we particularly feel that that is unwarranted is that on the morning, or rather the day of September 11th, someone had members of the White House staff, Cheney's office, I believe, at first, begin taking Cipro on the morning of September 11th, thereby making it an integral part of the attacks of 9/11, because there was some intelligence, some warning that was only passed on to White House officials, but not to the postal workers that were later killed as a result of the attacks 4 weeks later. That's one example. Another one is there's been no adequate explanation for why it is that Air Force jet fighters, strip alert, here in the D.C. area were able to defend the skies here in the area known as P-56, which is the zone over the Capitol, the White House, and so on, the nation's capital. There's been no adequate explanation. We understand that there were 3 jets from Andrews that were on an exercise over North Carolina, independent of the concurrent NORAD exercises that were happening that day. And yet, when I asked this of Jamie Gorelick, there was no comment. So this is an area that I hope the press will give some scrutiny to. So the anthrax, questions about the response from the Andrews Air Force Base. John, do you have any to add?
I just add one thing on the anthrax matter. There was a New York Times article that revealed in what was called bungling by the FBI or missteps in the investigation that during the time between the mailing of the first anthrax envelopes and the first person who ended up sick from them down in Florida, the FBI had contacted the University of Iowa at Ames, and in the discussion with them, there was an agreement made to destroy a 70-year-old archive of all known strains of the natural pathogen anthrax, which they had kept there at Ames. And when the DNA work was done on the anthrax samples, they were identified as Ames strain. Now, had that archive been kept, the DNA could have traced it to a particular batch or strain, and then that batch would have had a paper trail as to where that anthrax had been sent for research, either for cure or for weaponization. But also the weaponization level was so sophisticated that it clearly led back to U.S. AMRID, or it's the Fort Detrick and some other bases included, but primarily Detrick, that do research on bioweapons. On September the 9th, the day just 2 days before the attack, the Defense Intelligence Agency held a press briefing here in D.C. announcing that under Project Jefferson and the DIA, they had developed on Rumsfeld's request the next generation of anthrax, a genetically altered, more resistant to antibiotic, and more weaponized version of anthrax, which matches what was in these envelopes. And that investigation stopped there. The other major area, the third area that we were bringing up today, it's not the only ones mentioned in our report, but we think are important, is the one that Ray and Jules were addressing, the historical context of the creation of the Mujahideen and the covert operation that it represented, and the funding of that operation, which came through both Saudi Arabia and the United States intelligence agencies and Pakistani intelligence, BCCI, the Bank for Credit and Commerce International, and those elements were also similarly around the funding of the other major covert operation of the period, Contragate. And these were off-the-shelf or clandestine operations run by William Casey during the Reagan and Bush years. The plan started actually under Carter and Brzezinski. But that's really what led to the training camps and the building up of Islamic militants. Now, Brzezinski says that he thought it was a great idea at the time. He has no reason to apologize. He said, what are a few stirred-up Muslims compared to the fall of the Soviet Union? But I think some Americans have an answer to that question now.
The other item, which is somewhat related, is what we feel is the lack of inquiry hearing from witnesses relative to a $100,000 wire transfer that was reportedly approved by the head of the Pakistani intelligence agency, the ISI, and that this $100,000 wire transfer was made to Atta in advance of the attacks. So this is a trail that we believe Daniel Pearl was following, which led to his death. His widow, I understand, has asked about this and would like to see Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is also tied in with this, who allegedly slit Daniel Pearl's throat, brought to justice. But Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, on which the Commission bases much of its new information, has been held in an undisclosed location now for over a year, and certainly any kind of information coming from someone who's been held in an undisclosed location, probably tortured or drugged, is a questionable integrity.
Kyle, I'd like to add just a real small one here. I'd like to know how many of you have heard of Spike Bowman. Nobody. Spike Bowman was the FBI senior lawyer who spiked the Minneapolis office initiative to get access to Moussawi's computer and so forth. This was weeks before 9/11. They had Moussawi. He was one of the fellows that was training for air flight training in Minneapolis. Spike Bowman was the person who refused permission for them to do that. Had they been able to do that before 9/11 rather than after 9/11, this could have been prevented. And this is the clearest instance that we have. Now, Spike Bowman was given a cash award signed by the president barely a year later, $20,000, and praised for his contribution to the security of United States citizens. I want to know why that happened. Everyone knows what he did. Why did they give him an award barely a year later?
There's been a great pattern of awarding failure in the wake of 9/11, and as you know, I think that it merits a deeper look at some of the mounting body of evidence that suggests a wider circle of complicity. I'm sorry, take another question, please. And would you identify yourself?
Sure. Jeremiah McWilliams with ABC News. You said that the official story for what happened on 9/11 does not stand up to scrutiny. And early in the report, I think on a related note, it seems to suggest that the official case against Osama bin Laden is incomplete or weak. Could you clarify for us what you mean by the official story does not stand up to scrutiny?
Well, it starts with the 19 suspects, and the problem is... Oh, okay, I can do that. Thanks. The problem there is that the international press, BBC, and other sources reported that up to 7 of the suspects were still alive, based on the fact that people came forward with the same ID and name and matching photographs and said, that's me, it's my ID, but I wasn't on the plane. And so we began with a group of suspects who are operating under false ID. Those names have never been changed. They were supposedly based on information from the airline manifests that were released, but I went to those releases very early on, and they do not contain any of the names of the suspects. Each manifest is short, 4 or 5 names. And so we have no way to match even the airline manifests with the official story of who the suspects are. If these suspects are carrying other ID, which is not unthinkable in a criminal situation, then how can we rely on a story of who that ID was in the past? In other words, we say this is the person's name and identity, and this is what they were doing here and there. That ID could also have been passed to other people. So that's a way in a covert operation that you create what's called a legend. And you can set somebody up or give blame to somebody or create false sponsorship for an event. So first of all, I would say we don't know who the people are. Second, their pattern of activity does not seem to match people operating in the way they're supposed to be. They're making themselves very visible. There were numerous calls and complaints about them where they lived and where they dealt with things. There were reports of them going to bars and drinking, doing illegal drugs. Certainly not following a pattern that seems to be devout Muslims, but rather people with a lot of money and a lot of background. And I think there's also a question you have to consider about whether it's feasible to get groups of people over periods of time to agree to suicide missions. One person, yes. But even in the Khobar bombing, If you remember, 2 people were in the bombing truck, 1 jumped out at the last minute, and that's not uncommon in suicide pacts, much less 19 people agreeing to kill themselves all at once and take a bunch of people with them. And so what happened on the planes, we still don't know. And if this is what it appears to be, a very sophisticated covert operation, its sponsorship is going to be covered by definition from public view. And so we feel that indications that were mentioned in the joint inquiry report, that there were other countries involved, the 28 pages you may remember that were redacted so we couldn't know who they were, the wink and nod of Bob Graham that this was Saudi Arabia, and now the denial that Saudi Arabia was involved, no word of Pakistan or whether it was involved or whether other countries could have been involved in this operation. I'm just saying that there's box cutters and knives, the whole story just has a lot of flaws and a lot of pieces that were never followed up on. And we were also promised a white paper by Colin Powell, if you remember, about the guilt, and that was never given to the American public. It was, some facts were released to the British, and they said it's not enough to go to court, it's enough to go to war. But I think the case on bin Laden, I'm not saying he's an innocent party, but we really don't have a solid, and most of what we have now linking all these things to bin Laden is the testimony of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who no one can see except authorities, and no one knows whether he's, you know, at Abu Ghraib, where he's being held, is he being tortured, are these legitimate confessions, do they actually have Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? There was some question in the international press about that when he was arrested. So we're having to base a lot of this on sources and investigations that we can't know very much about. And I think that a real scrutiny of it suggests that you've got a broader sponsorship here than we're understanding as yet. The transfer of funds that Kyle mentions is important because the ISI in Pakistan was the main conduit of American funds to the Afghan resistance. And so this is an instance where somebody's passing money out of Pakistani ISI in August of 2001 to one of the main masterminds of the plot through international channels, not setting off the normal banking alarm bills for a $100,000 transfer somehow, and passing it through some intermediaries. And then afterwards, he is removed from his position at the ISI on his return to Pakistan from the United States for being too close to bin Laden and for this transfer. While he was here, he met with Colin Powell, Richard Armitage, George Tenet at the CIA, Porter Goss and Bob Graham on the morning of the event, and he had clearly ongoing ties with U.S. intelligence as well. We don't really know when U.S. intelligence connections to the Taliban, to the Afghan resistance, to the Islamic militants started, much less ended. And whether or not there are elements within the U.S. intelligence community that saw elements within that resistance as negative assets that they could use for international purposes that may or may not have gotten out of control in the situation.
I'm Al Milliken, affiliated with Washington Independent Writers. If you each were putting yourselves in the shoes or the minds of a terrorist or potential terrorist, what area not properly or fully answered do you think would give the enemy the most reason to be relieved or glad or feeling victorious?
Well, I think the fact